Hi everyone, Anne Bounty from Said with Love, and welcome back to week 2 of our Moon Diamond Sew Along that we're doing in conjunction with the Make Modern magazine. Hope you've got your subscription or have purchased the issue. If you haven't, links in the caption below. So this week we are going to start talking about fussy cutting. Now you don't have to do fussy cutting for this pattern. I've obviously chosen to fussy cut some of these blocks when I was making my original version of this, but then I've just used pieces of fabric. I haven't specifically fussy cut. I was going to point at this one, but that was fussy cut. But when you're looking at sort of more of an all over design in your fabric, they're not really fussy cut as such. So you don't have to do fussy cutting, but it is just the perfect opportunity to have a go at it. If you haven't tried fussy cutting before, then maybe this is a lovely chance to have a go at it and have a try. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about fussy cutting up close. So you're looking down at what I'm showing you on screen. But first of all, I want to talk about our templates. Now, I talked about printing them out last week, so hopefully you've got lots of lovely templates printed out onto some fairly light paper. But what I do suggest, if you're going to be doing fussy cutting, that you print out one more of your templates and find some cardboard. Now, if you've actually got card at home to print out your template on, awesome, fabulous. If not, the back of a cereal box works perfectly. So I have just glued one of my templates to this cereal box, and I am then going to cut out this center diamond so that I can use it as a fussy cutting as I move across the fabric, trying to find the best spot for the fabric to be. I'm also going to show you how then to do some things around the outside so that we can mark where we want to cut our fabric. So once we've found our nice little fussy cutting diamond spot on our fabric, we need to be able to give us our seam allowance and mark some spots so that we can come back and actually cut the fabric out. One thing I do with fussy cutting, I actually use scissors to cut my fabric out. I don't use a rotary cutter, basically because I like to use every skerrick of the fabric, and I never know what else I will use that fabric for. So, I've fussy cut it at, I have fussy cut out a lovely piece of the fabric, but I don't want my rotary cutter to have made cuts into other pieces of the fabric that 6 months later I might go, oh, that was the perfect bit, but I've got rotary cutting holes through the middle of it. So fussy cutting is always a bit of a difficulty because you end up with Swiss cheese fabric, but it can be worth it. Okay, so let's show you what this template looks like all cut out. Now, one thing I forgot to mention when you're printing out your templates, please, please, please make sure that you're printing them out at 100% or actual size. Quite a few places that you can open up a PDF template to print out have it set automatically by default to print to fit to size. No. So make sure that you're printing it to the correct size. In the pattern, I've given you the dimensions of this template so that you can double check. Always good to print this one first, double check that you're printing it at the correct sizing, and then go ahead and print the rest of your templates. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, I've gone and cut out the center of my template so that I can do some fussy cutting. Now, it's very tempting, even on card, to work out what your seam allowance is and just cut a sort of a bigger diamond, but admittedly this one is only on paper. It moves, it's a bit too flexible, shall we say. So I'm going to just work on a way to make some holes or some holes so that we can make some marks through the cardboard, so still leaving all of these bits out there so that we've got a little bit of stability, so that we can mark then direct onto the fabric. So I'll show you that now. Okay, so I am trying to come up with the best way to make some marks in my template to give us our seam allowance so that I can then use this not as a cutting out with a rotary cutter and things like that, but as a marking tool for my fussy cutting of my fabric. So I've got a few ideas. As I said to you before, just cutting out of the paper or even cardboard, it's going to be way too flexible. So I have a couple of options and ideas. One, I have this, what's called an awl, but basically it's a sharp point that I can pierce through the cardboard just at those outer points. So that would give me then the ability to mark onto my fabric. Now, when I mark onto my fabric, I use an air erasable pen, which means that it marks the fabric, and it's a sort of a purple colour, so it actually shows quite well on a lot of fabrics. But it then just literally erases, disappears after, depending on the weather, anything from an hour to a couple of hours. So that gives me a chance to sort of mark things out on my fabric and go and cut the fabric, and then it's disappeared. It's gone. It's fabulous. The other alternative or option is to use a cutting blade, which is why I've got a different cutting mat. This isn't one of my quilting cutting mats. This is a cutting mat. And I could go and work out what my seam allowance is. Now, I give more than a quarter of an inch seam allowance when I'm cutting fussy cutting fabric, basically because it gives you a little bit more wiggle room. So, whether you work out it's a quarter of an inch or a 3/8 of an inch or a half an inch is up to you. But I'm sort of thinking I could use this cutter to actually cut out sort of a line. So make two cuts, pull out a little bit of the cardboard so that then my pen could fit down and I could mark a line. So I'm going to try that, see whether that works. I would normally use a metal ruler, but I couldn't find my metal ruler. So I'm just going to use a normal quilting ruler. And we'll see whether this is a good way to do it. So after a little bit of faffing, it does require a lot more pressure than I had remembered. I've now sort of cut out this little bit, which will allow me then, when I'm looking at my fabric, to actually put marks along that line. So I might continue to do that. I'm going to leave all of this other cardboard so I still have a bit of rigidity for my template. So I'm just going to do along the sides. Okay, so to be honest, I wouldn't faff with this if I was only doing maybe one or two different fussy cuts, but because we have to fussy cut quite a lot of fabric, it is perhaps worth spending a little bit of time to make this kind of template. So the last bit I'm going to do is put these holes on the seam allowance outer corners. Already got that one there, and I've already got that one there. So there we have, it's a little bit scrabbly. I'll get rid of this bottom bit down here. But there is a fussy cutting template that we've just made. Okay, now let's get to some fussy cutting. Now, the one thing with fussy cutting is that you can't specify a certain amount of fabric that you need because it depends on the fabric. So I'm using Tula Pink's Everglow for mine, which has perfect fussy cutting opportunities. Here's the lion shape, and I'm going to be using that when when I'm showing you more detail about fussy cutting. But as you can see, there's lots of them, and you think, oh, that's fabulous. I'll be able to get my however many we need out of here without any problems. But of course, once you start, and I'll just use my very flexible template to give you an example. When I put my template up here, and I get my lion vaguely centered, whoops, there's not enough fabric up here, so I can't use the ones along the top. And so I then try and use the ones more in the middle, which is fantastic, and think, oh, great, there's quite a lot here. I can use this one and that one. But the templates overlap each other once you start taking into account your seam allowances. So even though there are lots and lots of lions on here, you would need way more than a fat quarter. I think I've got a 1/2 metre by width of fabric of this. So I'm going to be fine. I'm going to have no problems getting all my lines out. But just be very aware when you're picking out your fabrics from your stash or going to a shop that with fussy cutting, you need more fabric than you ever think of. So when it comes to perhaps some of the other fabrics that I'm going to be using, so maybe for example, the hippopotamus, who's an absolute cutie. Again, I've got a 1/2 metre of this. There are lots of different hippos on here, and I could use some different types of things. So, maybe I could use the diamond over the top so that, you can see the bird sitting on his head. But maybe I also want to use this one. So you need to be able to make sure that you can get a number of fussy cuts out of your fabric. So I've tried to explain that in the pattern as well, that if you're just using any piece of fabric and you're not doing fussy cutting, there's a certain amount of fabric you're going to need. Otherwise, you're going to need as much as it takes. Bit hard with fussy cutting, but it does leave lots of fabric over for doing other things as well. Okay, so let's get to some discussions about fussy cutting. So we've got our template so that we can start to work around our fabric and go, yeah, that's where I want my fussy cutting to be, my positioning. This comes down to personal preference, but I do like things to be sort of even in both directions. And what we're looking for too are some points where you can easily find this fussy cutting motif elsewhere in the fabric. So is it that you're right on the edge of this little blue flower, you're at the middle of that blue drop or flower or leaf or whatever it is, or are you up here on this little pink one? Whatever is going to allow you to easily find this position again. So I am pretty happy with that. We've got a little bit of the blue leafy bits down here and up there. This seems to be quite centered. I could perhaps drop it just a little bit, but I quite like how these two green leaves are sort of coming and framing the top of him. So I think I'm pretty good. So I'm now going to get my air erasable pen and I'm going to make a mark in those corners or those diamond corners, and I'm going to just pop some into those lines that we cut out. So that is going to be enough for me to then just finish sort of making that mark between the dot at the point. So my point's out here. And then I can come and cut this out and we will have our first fussy cut line. Now, as I said, I use scissors to cut my fussy cuts out, basically because I don't want my rotary cutter to sort of make a crisscross at the end of each line that will then take into the next possible fussy cut for the future. So what I do is actually fold, or put a fold in the fabric that's as straight as possible so that this line continues up and over, so that I can make a little snip on that line, and I can then come in and use my scissors to continue on that line. Now, I gave myself, I think it was more like a 3/8, almost to a half an inch kind of seam allowance. So I've got plenty of little wiggle room. If you're doing EPP and your fussy cuts are going to be butted up against each other, so that you're perhaps trying to make a different pattern out of your fussy cuts, Lilibelle Lane Creations does this beautifully. You do need to make sure that where you fussy cut out your motif is exactly the same every time. But with what we're doing today for our moon diamond pattern, it's not as crucial. If if my next lion is, just a little bit further down or a little bit further around, it's not going to matter, because I'm not going to have something butted up that's perhaps going to make a leaf motif or something like that. So there is my first lion. So I've got a few more to do, and then I start to have some fun with my other fabrics and see where the best fussy cut option for here is. So, maybe, you're so tempted to just go straight with your elephant, but I am missing his bottom foot. If I wanted to get his bottom foot, I'd need to angle it that way, but then my elephant's kind of walking downhill. So I'm thinking I will stick with this. Oh, one thing, I haven't pressed this fabric. I had pressed my line. Always a good idea to press your fabric before you start fussy cutting. Just one more thing back here on the lions. As I was saying, in terms of the amount of fabric that you may need. So we fussy cut that line. Awesome. I couldn't come and then fussy cut this line right next to it, because over here there is no fabric. So whilst the actual diamond is fine, there's no seam allowance. So we can't just go 1, 2, 3, 4. With the lines, I think it is possible. Let me just check that. Am I going to be sort of up there? Just, absolutely perfectly just. The seam allowance is right on the edge of the fabric. So I could, offset and get the 4 lines down the fabric like that. So that's cool. That's what I'll be doing next. So hopefully that's given you a bit of some tips for how to fussy cut your fabrics. So I hope that little intro to fussy cutting has given you a bit of some ideas. Maybe you're going to change up the fabrics that you use for this pattern. If you want to this week, you can do a test block. We've got the cutting instructions, etc. in the patterns, so you could go ahead and do a test block. If you haven't done any foundation paper piecing before, or you feel you need a refresher, hang off until next week. We'll go through how to do the foundation paper piecing and get started on our first few blocks. So go ahead, have some fun, enjoy your fussy cutting if you're going to do it, and I can't wait to see what you're up to on socials or in our Facebook Sewalong Quilting group. See you next week.